I'm going to bring you to I don't know what that is. Just throw that down there. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to AI. My name is Robert Dorr, and I'm the Mortgage Fellow in Poverty Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute. I've been here for about 3 years, and over the time that I've been here, since coming from being in charge of social services under Mayor Bloomberg in New York City, we've done programs on work, family, public assistance programs, culture, and all of them have been with a focus on how we can help our country become better by offering greater opportunity to all Americans. And today's topic, improving opportunity for people with disabilities, understanding trends and effective return to work strategies, is very consistent with that theme. 25% of those not in the labor force participation rate, not in the labor force, say that they are in that situation because of some form of disability or health issue. And 50% of men between 25 and 54 say that. So the topic is an important one, and we have an outstanding group of panels, 2 panels, and panelists to help us discuss this important issue. I want to first credit my colleague Angela Rashidi, a research fellow here at AI, for help putting this together. She's an outstanding researcher and commentator and policy advisor on poverty issues. This is an important topic to her. Thank you, Angela, for making it possible. Our first panel will be moderated by Scott Winship, who is our great friend around Washington. He is a visiting fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, a new think tank focused on upward mobility for the bottom half of Americans. Previously, he was the Walter B. Wriston Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a fellow at the Brookings Institution. He has a PhD in social policy from Harvard. And then before I get out of the way and turn it over to the real experts who are really going to, I think, get this discussion going, I just wanted to say how proud and pleased we are to have Professor Case with us from Princeton. We're honored to have you in the building. And I also need to say, Rich Burkhauser, you are a longtime friend and contributor to AI. It's great to have you here as well. But I also want to give a special mention to Nick, who has done so much important work on this topic. And you know, here at AI, we've got a new building, you might have noticed, and we've done some interesting things. And one of the things we have in our elevators is we have important quotes from people who've said important things about topics concerning public policy in the United States. And one of them that we have up that we look at every morning is this from Nick, who wrote, "Human beings are the true wealth of nations. People are a resource, not a problem." And I wanted to begin this discussion by calling attention to that and that theme, because I hope that informs our discussion today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott, hand the clicker to Nick, and get out of the way without tripping across the stage. There you go. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you to everybody for coming out on this lovely April afternoon. Picked a great day. So just to frame this panel very quickly, as Robert said, there's been a very striking decline in labor force participation, particularly among men. Whether that decline is about a weakness in the economy, or if it's about an increasing unwillingness of some men who could work to work, or whether it's about an increasing inability of people to work because health has actually deteriorated. The answer to that question is really one of the most important ones that I think we face in public policy today. In large measure, the decline in workforce participation among men has been mirrored in an increase in receipt of disability benefits. And so what we're going to take a look at on this panel, I think, is to try to assess the extent to which this increase in disability receipt reflects policy changes, or does it reflect changes in the underlying health of the population? I think it's going to be a great panel. We've got an all-star lineup here. So as a housekeeping item, we're going to be taking questions from our online audience today. Welcome. If you want to submit a question for consideration, All you need to do is go to slido.com. It's SLIDO.com. You enter code AEI event. That's all one word with event capitalized. And you just enter your name and your question, your social security number, major credit cards, and you're good to go. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Nick Eberstad holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at AEI. Nick leads a double life, studying international security in Asia. But more importantly for us, he's a leading expert on demography and poverty research. His latest book is Men Without Work, America's Invisible Crisis, published by Templeton Press. It's about the decline in male labor force participation. It's a fantastic book, would recommend it to all of you. Richard Burkhauser is the Sarah Gibson Blanding Professor of Policy Analysis in the Department of Policy Analysis and Management at Cornell University. And he's a senior research fellow at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also a non-resident fellow here. Rich has done some of the very best research on income trends, inequality, mobility. He's also a top scholar of disability, which is why he's here today. And for our purposes, the most important thing you should know about him is that he's the author with Mary Daly of The Declining Work and Welfare of People with Disabilities, which AEI Press put out here a couple of years ago. Also a great book. And then finally, we have Ann Case, who also has a wealthy person's name in her title, not to be outdone. She's the Alexander Stewart 1886 Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton, where she is the Director of the Research Program in Development Studies. Anne is the nation's foremost scholar of the ways in which family background and health are interrelated, which is how I know her work. And she's renowned as a development economist as well. She's published prolifically, but she's here because she wrote with Angus Deaton what one of my favorite journalists called, quote, the most talked about academic paper of 2015 on rising morbidity and mortality, which I can report personally caused a whole lot of conversation on Twitter for a couple of weeks. So thank you to everyone for coming, and we're going to start with Nick.
Thank you very much, Scott. Angela, thank you so much for pulling this together. This is such an important topic. I think in truth in advertising, I'd have to say I'm the interloper on this panel. I'm up here because I spent part of last year trying to educate myself about the problem of declining labor force participation for men. And there were a lot of questions, which were kind of obvious questions, that I tried to inform myself about before I dared to write about this more generally. And one of them had to do with disability and with disability insurance programs. And one of the things which I found very quickly as I was scratching my head about this was that there was no central information source in the US government about disability programs and disability program participation. We have a sort of a patchwork quilt, a large and very expensive patchwork quilt that includes things like Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, also SSI, both with the Social Security Administration. There are veterans benefits, there are workers' comp, there are private disability programs. There's no central authority for tracking all of these. The closest that I could find for this was a Census Bureau survey called SIP, Survey of Income and Program Participation. It relies upon self-reported results, which are slightly adjusted, as these tend to be. But this gives us at least a first approximation, good enough for government work, we might say, of what the outlook is, what the distribution is. And I put up a slide here which shows what the SIP reported results were in 1985 and in 2013. And if the numbers are too small, we can play read to the blind. You'll have to trust me, but you can go back and look at them online. There was an increase in reported proportion of prime age men, 25 to 54-year-old men, receiving one or more disability benefits over this period of almost 30 years, from about 4% to about 6%. That doesn't sound like much, but it's all concentrated in the men who are out of the labor force. And according to the SIP results, in '85, about 2 in 5 men out of the labor force were receiving benefits from at least one disability program. By 2013, it was 3 in 5. There are a certain proportion of people who are receiving more than one benefit from these programs. And of course, also this establishes eligibility for means-tested benefits. The most important means-tested benefit I would submit, I've got it in red on this graphic, is Medicaid, is health services. And about half of the men who were out of the labor force in this prime age group reported being enrolled in Medicaid. Why is this important? Among other reasons, because of the opioid explosion. What has Medicaid allowed people to do? Until very recently, with the tightening up of rules, for a $3 copay, you could get a very generous month's supply of OxyContin or other painkillers. So Medicaid has played it's brought new meaning to dependence on government, let's say. It's had a very important and inadvertent impact, I think, on the situation of men out of the labor force. So we can parse these numbers in different sorts of ways, and in the next couple of charts, I want to show you a couple of different ways of parsing these. The first is by educational background. We see that the enrollment or dependence upon disability programs really tracks with educational attainment. And if you are talking about a guy who's in prime age group without a high school degree, a high school dropout, about a 3 in 4 chance of being enrolled in at least one disability program, about 5 in 6 chances of being in a household that gets a disability benefit. If you just closed your eyes and were told about somebody, you'd say they're most likely in those programs. Much less at higher levels of educational attainment. And by the way, in terms of Medicaid, almost 80% for the non-high school degree guys. If we look at, can we look at anything else? You'll have to trust me when I tell you that. We can see some differences in terms of marital status, but they're not nearly as dramatic as the differentials we see by educational status, or we might say social economic status, class status. Yes, do these cut the way that some of us might have guessed? Yes. More participation, more dependence by never married than currently married. But the differentials aren't as big as the educational differentials. And finally, some ethnic differentials. The Anglos, on the whole, have somewhat slightly lower participation than Latino or African American. But if you take all of these things together, I would say that the important driver that jumps out is the difference in educational attainment that we see here. Anyhow, that's just by way of general background. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Scott mentioned a book that Mary Dale and I wrote in 2011 on disability issues. I've actually come to hawk a different book this morning, and it's a book that just came out by AEI called The U.S. Labor Market, Questions and Challenges for Public Policy. And Mary and I have a single chapter in it on disability, but it's an important chapter in the sense that this book is about how to get people who are expected to work into the workforce and employed. And it's an important statement to make that people with disabilities are disabled for 2 reasons, that is out of the labor force. One, because of impairments that they have, but second, because of the social environment that they face. And the modern way of thinking about people with disabilities is to recognize that, and to recognize, especially since the ADA, that the social environment is as important as the impairment itself to the question of whether a person with disabilities is going to be in the labor force. So instead of talking about, as we did before 1990, a goal of social policy to protect the less abled who are not expected to work, the modern way of thinking about it is to ensure that those with impairments integrate into employment and society to the fullest extent of that their ability allows. And the premise of Mary Daly and I's book a few years ago, and the point of this article that looks much more in detail for other countries, is that the rhetoric is there in the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 that people with disabilities can and will work if given the opportunity. But the reality is an increasing share of working age people with disabilities are on the SSDI program and are not working or on SSI for the same reason. What happened, my judgment, is the worst fear of original legislators, the legislators in the 1930s who had seen that in 1890 the most expensive item on the federal budget in 1890 was disabled Civil War veterans, and recognized that they were going to keep the retirement program as far away from the disability program as possible. And it didn't happen until the late 50s that we put our foot into the water of having a DI program. So what's the worst fear? Increasingly becoming a permanent unemployment program, discouraging work and encouraging movement onto the disability rolls. And the argument I would make is change is possible. It doesn't have to be that way. This is a policy-induced outcome, so policy-induced changes are possible, and we have a way of knowing how other countries have fallen into this and how they've gotten themselves out of it, and that's just to simply look at the success of European disability programs and the reforms they've made over the last 40 years. So, key disability measure that tells you exactly what's going on with regard to the impact of the DI program or the benefit programs to disabled is the disability recipiency rate, that is, the number of working age disabled beneficiaries for all working age people. And if you go and look at growth in disability recipiency across countries, you see a rather amazing variation across countries, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the United States in this picture, in terms of the levels of that ratio, and more importantly, the tremendous change over time in that ratio. It is hard to believe that this is driven by health differences either across countries or over time, and the thrust of the work that we've been doing is to argue that it has in fact not been primarily caused by changes in health, but rather by changes in government policy. And if you just look at, if I can get this baby to, there we go. If you look at average annual growth in disability recipiency by decade in countries, you see in the 70s, the Netherlands annually had an increase of 11% in their disability rolls. Other countries were high. The United States was 5.6. In the 80s, all of them went down. Germany and the United States actually negative. In the 90s, the United States took over as the leader in annual increases in disability, and in the 2000s, the United States was still high. Over the entire period, because we started so low, our annual increases are higher than all the others. Okay, as a result of this, the OECD called for fundamental reforms. I won't read this, I've only got 7 minutes, but let's go to the first one. There's an urgent need to address the medicalization of labor market problems by tackling the widespread use of disability benefits across the OECD countries and promoting labor market participation of people with disabilities. That's in the preamble of a book by the OECD in 2010, and it is in reaction to the major changes that went on in European countries to get a hold of these increases in prevalence rates on the rolls and to do something about it. Okay, so what's been happening in the United States? Well, very quickly, if you look at the trends in employment of working age adults 18 to 64 with and without disabilities, and the gray things are periods of recession, NDER recession periods, you'll see between 1980 and 1989, the working age people with disabilities reacted the same as working age people without disabilities, and during recessions their employment went down, during recovery their employment went up. But something dramatic has been happening since 1989, while the working age folks with not with disabilities continue to experience these kinds of trends that are related to the business cycle, it's been almost continuous downhill for people with disabilities. So what's been behind that? Well, I would argue that in part what's been behind it is that while the market income of the households of men and women with disabilities, while their market income has been going down, along with their employment, the after-tax income plus health insurance adjusted for household size and in the usual way that's done in the literature, the benefits going to people with disabilities have actually been rising since 1989, making it that path to income a more lucrative path, certainly not as good as if you stayed into the workforce, but in fact we've been putting more resources into the DI and SSI program, as well as especially what Nick talked about, Medicare and Medicaid. Work limitations really haven't changed very much over this period. It's hard to argue that there's been a dramatic increase in self-reported work limitations. DI prevalence by age, it's not just the old folks. There's been an increase in people on the DI rates across the board in terms of age groups. And as a matter of fact, the fastest increase in prevalence rate has been among those 20 to 29 and 30 and 39. So what to do about this? Well, what we know in the best work that's actually tried to do, what I've been talking about is descriptive sort of analysis. In the best serious analysis of the importance of the DI program with regard to its negative effects on employment, look at a really major work by Mastis, Mullen, and Strand in 2013 in the American Economic Review, in which they have a natural experiment going on where they look at differences in the hardness or ease of decisions by DDS officers who some interpret the rules a little more strict than others. They control for that. They look at people with similar conditions that go before the strict judges and get onto the roll versus those who go by the less strict folks and don't get on the rolls. And what we find out, or what they found out, is 23% of initial applicants are marginal entrants. That is, they got on or didn't get onto the rolls depending on the luck of the draw and who evaluated their case. They then looked at what happened to those people who got off versus those people who got on. SSDI acceptance caused a 21% point reduction in their employment relative to SSDI rejection control groups. The marginal treatment effects, less severe impaired, 60% decreases in their employment. The most severely impaired, less so, 10%, but nonetheless, this is a serious piece of work, probably the best in the literature that shows the effect of DI on eventual employment. And with that, I will end, but I can't, won't let me move. So.
Probably not going to be any better at it, but could just, oop.
I'll quit there and
Okay.
save that for later.
Oh, now we've just dumped it onto.
Here we are. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about this. I'm going to come at this at a slightly different angle. When you look at the disability receipt rates since the early 1990s, I think Jeff Liebman's piece is really quite convincing that 2/3 of the increase can be explained by the aging of the US population and women entering the labor force and having enough work experience to be covered by the program. Now that's 2/3. That still leaves 1/3. But I think doing any of this without age adjusting is somewhat problematic. But that last third, Jeff Liebman hadn't seen the work I do. Like, it's always important to put it in the context of your work, when he wrote his piece. And so he said there have been large increases in the incidence of lower back pain and mental health issues increasing on the rolls. And he said, but that, of course, that might be real, or maybe that's because of labor market conditions. And I think what I would like you to take away from what I'm about to say is that it might be real. I mean, I think there's something sort of profound going on out there that is causing real heartache. And I'm going to start with a body count. We're going to look at mortality. And I think it's really important, as Rich said, to compare yourself to other countries. So these are mortality rates of people aged 45 to 54 in 6 rich countries from the late 1980s to the 20-teens. So these are deaths per 100,000. And you can see that the mortality rate is falling at about 2% a year over this period. You could name me your favorite European country. I guarantee you it's falling at 2% a year over this period. But that is not what happened in America. Right? Starting in the late 1990s, among white non-Hispanics, mortality rates in middle age started to rise. After a century of progress, Mortality rates have gone from 1,400 to 400 over the 20th century for whites 45 to 54. And then suddenly it starts to turn around. What's going on there? Hispanics is the thick blue line, and they look a lot like the people in the UK. They're doing just fine, thank you. And Black non-Hispanics started a higher mortality rate, but their mortality is falling rapidly as well. You could pick other 5-year cohorts. Our original paper, this is work with Angus Deaton, took a couple of early hits saying, well, over that period, within that band, people are getting older. So what I'll show you generally are 5-year age groups. But you can see people in their 20s, early 30s, people in their 40s. At best, their mortality rates have flatlined, and at worst, they're actually increasing. I want you to focus on the left-hand panel here. In very careful work, Johann Mackenbach and a series of researchers looked at mortality declines in Europe for people who had low education and people who have high education. And I agree with Nick here. A lot of this is going to be about education and things we're going to have to understand more. In Europe, the change in mortality was better for people with low education over this period than people with high education. They both fell. They both did very well, but people with low education were doing even better. All right, now look at the right-hand panel. This is the US. This is the US by 5-year age groups. People with a high school degree or less, that's our working class, that's our low education at this point, their mortality rates are rising. Whereas people with a college degree, their mortality rates over this 20-year period have been falling. These are men, the same is true for women. I wanted to, in honor of Nick, we did a lot of slides for men because with a look at men. And for your youngins in the audience, if you want to make your slides look dramatic for young people, do it in terms of percent change, right? Because their rates are lower to start with. So as a percentage, the people in their 20s and early 30s look even worse if you do it this way, all right? But you can see for people with a college degree, there's been a 40% change drop in their mortality over a 20-year period. That's the 2% a year that you're seeing in the European countries. So our BAs look like Europeans in general, but our people with a high school degree look a heck of a lot worse. Now, what is going on here, and what is going on here? There, go.
You want me to try to click it? I have
That would
trouble
be-
with it myself.
There you go. So part of what's going on here, and I'll get to this slide in a second, is that our progress on heart disease has flatlined for working class people. So what I'm about to show you would not have made news if we continued to make progress on heart disease. We don't understand that, but it's a fact. But that wouldn't have pushed up the rates. The reason the rates went up was because of drug overdose. That's legal, that's your OxyContin, but before that, that was your Percocet, and illegal drugs. Because of alcohol-related liver mortality, cirrhosis, alcoholic liver disease, and suicide. So the red line in each one of these cases are people with a high school degree or less, and we're tracking them over their time, and we're looking at their mortality rates from those things. Now, all three of these, if you add them together, we call these the deaths of despair, right? Because these are deaths that should not have to happen. This is things that really should not happen here. But if you add them all together, people who kill themselves quickly with a gun or slowly with drugs or alcohol, you get a very smooth increase for people with a high school degree or less. What don't you see there? You don't see the Great Recession. You don't see the go-go years of the 90s. What you see is a very smooth increase over time that suggests something is wrong. And it's not just men. Women and men have seen the same trend since before the turn of the century. That women started a lower rate, but it's women also killing themselves, overdosing with drugs, rates of cirrhosis increasing as well. In all age groups, I've just focused on this little one. I don't have enough time to really talk about the health underneath this, but I am going to take a little bit of issue with what Rich said. People's health, self-reported health in the US has fallen for white non-Hispanics. in answer to the question, how is your health at present, which is a question that's asked every year in nationally representative samples. These are men again, women look identical. In 1993 to 95, that's the blue line. People answering this question, white non-Hispanics from ages 30 to the late 70s. You can see at age 30, about 70% of them are reporting excellent or very good health. The first thing your eye sees is that falls with age. So I tell my students, you can kind of sort of see where you are and you can see where this is going, right? Which is not looking good. But what's also happened, and more important for today, is that year on year on year, at any given age and middle age, fewer and fewer people are reporting themselves in excellent or very good health. That's true in this data source, that's true in the National Health Interview Survey, that's true. So this is really, the elderly are doing well, they're not our topic today, but for, I would say about 30% of the people in the room, you're good. Yeah, this is things are gonna look good for you. Mental health, and I don't have time to go into this in detail, but the scores on mental health for people with a high school degree or less have gotten much worse. So a significantly higher fraction being reported in a state of serious mental distress. All right, not true for people with a BA. Thank you very much. They're doing just fine. Sciatic pain, which if any of you have ever suffered from it, is lower back pain that shoots down your leg. If you look at, these are men, women look the same. People with a high school degree or less, their reports of sciatic pain have skyrocketed. And the reports of people with a high school degree or less who say they are unable to work. Not that they can't find work, but that they can't work, which I think comes back to, is this real or is this just something you say for the benefits? So I just want to leave you with this, which is a slide. It's a little complicated, but I think I can explain it in the 60 seconds I have left, which is we're looking at the fraction of people not in the labor force. This is true for every 5-year age group. I just wanted to give you one of them. This is men 40 to 44. Blue is the fraction not in the labor force, and you can read that fraction off the left-hand axis here. So from the early 1990s to 2015, it went from about 10% to upwards of almost 20%. Whereas for people with a BA, it's creeped up a little bit, but not very much. The red, that's the mortality rate from these deaths of despair. That's their deaths from suicide, drug overdose, and cirrhosis. And the close articulation between the mortality and the not in the labor force is at least suggestive of the fact that perhaps these people really are much sicker than a generation that came before. Because this increase in mortality rates in middle age is large enough now to have actually decreased life expectancy in the US, while all other countries in the rich world continue to see life expectancy increase. And the force that's bearing down on life expectancy in the US is what's happening to middle-aged whites. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you all. Well, this is great stuff. I think in a moment, I think we want to try to dive in and try to reconcile some of the results that look in conflict and figure out if they are in conflict, if there is some explanation that reconciles all of the evidence. But first, I kind of wanted to just take a step back and ask Nick whether he can help us understand how important has the increase in disability self-reported or in receipt of disability benefits been for the rise in, or the decline in labor force participation? What are some of the other factors, just to give us a sense of the bigger problem?
I don't think there's anyone who can make the causal case between the rise in disability recipients and the decline in labor force participation or the exit from the labor force. I mean, I just don't think you can do that methodologically. What you can say is that disability payments from government and other means-tested payments have increasingly financed living standards or living arrangements for people who are not in the workforce, along with members of their households or members of their family. I would say, I mean, in my own homework, and this takes us a little bit outside of disability, I see the shameful, yawning gap in our statistical system as being its disinterest in the 20 million people who have a felony conviction in their background and are not behind bars. I can't tell you what the proportion of people who are suffering disability is there. I can't tell you the proportion of people who are on disability programs there, because the US government hasn't bothered to collect that information. It's twice as large a population as our undocumented or illegal, alien, whatever you want to call that group. It's twice as big, and it's utterly invisible from the standpoint of our policymakers.
Okay, I think Anne has really compelling evidence that the health of middle-aged non-Hispanic whites has deteriorated, and so I think the question for the broader topics that we're talking about, it's how relevant is that how relevant is that increase for debates over declining labor force participation, debates over rising disability receipt. I think that the trends don't necessarily line up. I think Rich has presented evidence that the rise in disability receipt, for instance, starts in the late 1980s. Labor force participation has been falling, for decades. So maybe is that a way to reconcile this clear deterioration that you've identified with some of the other claims that we've heard up here? Go first, Dan.
It's hard without the data, right? So I would not want to actually posture here. One question that I would ask is, I agree with the fact that disability insurance is probably keeping body and soul together for people, and I guess the question is that what disability insurance is supposed to be doing? That's sort of above my pay grade, but I would say that it's a question well worth asking.
Do we know how much what's happened to population health more broadly if we sort of scope away from non-Hispanic middle-aged men?
It's not just the men, right?
Okay.
It's men and women. So then we're talking about actually the majority of middle-aged people, right?
Yep.
We know Hispanics have higher labor force participation rates than whites, right? They also have lower mortality rates than whites. We know that Black non-Hispanics have lower participation rates than whites, and they have higher mortality rates. They've been declining, but they're still higher, right? So if you line it up that way, it's the question of which came first, falling out of the labor force or becoming addicted to a serious drug, or becoming depressed to the point of deciding that it's time to end it all. I mean, those are the kind of naughty questions that it's very hard, that you can't run a randomized control trial and find out the answer to that, right? So it's a hard, but for Hispanics, I think at least the labor force participation matches their ranking in terms of mortality.
So I would say you have before you in a panel 3 people who have given you very serious storytelling. That is, we are comparing relationships and perhaps inferring something from those relationships. But you talked about controlled trials. I just told you that in Mastis' work, she actually does have a controlled trial where she's observing people who, some of whom get onto the rolls and some of whom who don't, and whose characteristics are exactly the same, and finding a 23% change.
As you know, that's what they would call a natural experiment. That's not a randomized control trial, right? And also, then it may hold for people right at the margin, but it doesn't tell you
Well,
about what
23%.
happens right at the margin. There are 23%.
23% of people who at the margin, they're getting onto the rolls or not getting onto the
No,
rolls
but
was
those,
based on the luck of the
but then
draw.
then you're only comparing the people right at the margin with people right at the margin who made it or didn't make it, and it doesn't really tell you about people who are out farther in the distribution. But I think that's kind of a side.
So, but aside from that, if you just look at your mortality rates, they really don't start to go up for men until 2000, but the increase in disability started in 1990.
The mortality from drugs, alcohol, and suicide go back as far as we're able to take the education in the death certificates, which is 1992. That steady upward decline was on its way up at least as far back as the early 1990s. I don't know how much farther before that.
So I guess when you see the decline in prevalence of bad health in European countries, it would really be nice to look before 1990, back from 1970 to 1990, when the disability rates were gigantically increasing, and see whether you also see this increase in disability or whether it's more related to the generosity of the programs and eligibility and ease of getting on there. I can't tell from what you've shown me what's going on, but more importantly, when you're talking about a disability program, you're talking about a program that is supposed to be for people who are unable to work based on their health conditions as defined by the program. You're seeing dramatic differences by country that don't seem to line up with your mortality rates, at least. So have you tried to look to see the degree that your health measures actually line up the differences and changes in disability population on the rolls?
We know the disability rates are going up. We know people's self-assessed health is going down. We know people's mortality rates are going up. I'm not sure I understand. I didn't show you anything on the self-assessed health in Europe, right? I'm not.
Well, you showed that those
That
rates
was
were
the
all going
US.
down. No, you showed the one with the
That was
multiple
mortality.
countries. Mortality.
That's
okay.
death. That's a
I
body
see.
count,
I see.
right?
So, Rich, you showed that that work limitations haven't worsened over time, but the increase of disability benefits has. Can you talk about some of the policy changes that you think are behind this greater propensity to receive benefits?
Well, I think what you see in Germany or in the Netherlands is when they changed the rules in terms of eligibility for benefits, you see a dramatic change in the number of people coming on the rolls. The Germans in the 1980s, or I'm sorry, the 1970s, were the first to say to the population that we're going to allow people who don't have that have a partial disability but are unemployed to get full disability benefits. And when you see that beginning in '69, you see a dramatic increase in the number of people who are coming onto the rolls because you're giving people with partial disabilities full disability benefits. When they stopped doing that in the 1980s, their disability program rolls go down. The Dutch do that in a big way in the 1980s. So you can see changes in the eligibility standards driving, for the most part, changes in the prevalence rates on the rolls. It's hard to believe that just immediately after a change in policy, suddenly you get this change without it being mainly with regard to the policy. If you look at what's been going on in the United States, we had changes in the 1980s, in 1980, that changed the criteria for reviews. We did the reviews. Most of us agreed that the Reagan administration pushed those evaluations in too great a way. We got a remarkable decline in the number of people on the rolls, even in a point where there was a recession. That was probably a bad idea. But in response to that, we had a change in the criteria, the standard for eligibility onto the rolls. And what we see since 1990 is a substantial increase in the criteria for getting onto the rolls, vocational characteristics, which were sort of supposed to be a secondary cause for coming onto the rolls become the majority of people coming onto the rolls are based on vocational criteria. We have pain with musculoskeletal conditions and mental illness driving over 50% of the people coming onto the rolls. Those are the hardest to evaluate. And you put tremendous pressure on your gatekeepers to make these very difficult decisions about who gets on and who doesn't get on. And that's how you end up with 23% of the population coming onto the rolls being the luck of the draw of people who come onto the rolls.
So one last question from me, and then we'll open it up. So what should we be doing to improve the opportunities of the disabled and of able-bodied people who are receiving disability benefits, or just to improve the health status of middle-aged non-Hispanic whites? Nick, you?
Well, I mean, I suppose you can say that it's always the researcher's cowardly answer to say we need more information, but we sure do. I'd say that this discussion makes it quite obvious that we need much more information. We need much better clinical evaluation of people who are out of the labor force, who are on disability programs. Self-assessed health reporting is good as far as it goes, but there are famous limitations to that. People who are better educated and more affluent always have higher expectations of their own health. I mean, you can see this wonderful chart showing self-assessed health in the U.S. in the early 1980s versus rural India in the 70s. Guess who said that they were healthier? People in rural India in the 70s. Their expectations were so much lower. But there's just, we could do so much better in understanding this if we wanted to. We really could.
So I think the first thing we can do is listen to the second panel, which is actually doing something, making disability policy a workforce policy. But we can also look to see how those roles got down in Europe. And the way they got down in Europe is to stop making excuses for why the disability roles are increasing and recognize that it's policy driven and policy changes can matter. And what we have in the Netherlands is we have a system now in the Netherlands, which is experience rated, which says that if one of your workers leaves your job, you're responsible for that worker for the first 2 years of paying that worker benefits. And after that, you've got to convince the disability insurance company that you've legitimately tried to return that person to work, and the worker has to show that he has tried or she has tried to get back on those roles. And if that doesn't happen, then the firm is still responsible for you. When you did that, a tremendous private insurance system opened up that was experience rated, and the employment rate of people with disabilities went up. And the Dutch have much less serious problems than they did before. The Germans did the same thing. They changed their system from one where a disability was based on your occupation as it was. That is, if you were a high-skilled worker and you could only do low skills, you got on the disability rolls because it was based on your high skill. They changed that in the late 1990s, and they said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to make it like the United States, where it's you get on if you can do any job. Suddenly, a private market opened up that allowed people to buy private insurance, and now 60% of German workers are covered by private insurance, men, and 40% of women. There's lots of things that can happen once we realize that DI and SSI shouldn't be excuses. I want to help low-income people too, but not through DI and SSI. I want to help them more directly. I don't like to see people run out of unemployment benefits and be in bad shape. But let's deal with unemployment problems with an unemployment system, not with a disability system.
I think we need to do more for people who are disabled. And I think the medical care that they receive may actually be sometimes counterproductive. I want to go back to something Nick said earlier about the delivery of OxyContin, which is basically heroin in a pill. A very cheap way to take care of people who are ill, who have pain, there really has been, though, a tremendous increase in the levels of pain that go along with the increases in suicide and drug overdose. And what we're going to do about that, I think that our focus, I don't think people kill themselves to increase their DI benefits. So I actually do think that we need to figure out how we hold the people who provide health care responsible for providing health care that's going to work for this population.
Could I say one thing? In Anne's slides and in my slides, and I think in Rich's slides also, we see a story which I think is still underreported, which is the story of the white opioid epidemic in America over the last 20 years. And that story has its own narrative and is a terrible, tragic story which is ongoing. We see a lot of that in there. I would commend to anyone who hasn't read it a wonderful, horrible book by Sam Quinones, Dreamland, which is journalism at its best, describing the unfolding of the white heroin epidemic. Understanding that particular aspect of what is in here, I think, is absolutely critical.
Great. Time for a few questions. In the front row here. Maybe he can operate the clicker.
Okay. Yeah, I think the mic. I was going to say, I think the mic is on disability. My name is Todd Wiggins. Good afternoon. One thing I just want, before my question, I wanted to say one thing that was very heartening about something that was said, and that was that education is relevant, or even more relevant than racial class. Because unfortunately, we cannot juggle the racial class, but we can certainly affect education. So I wanted to know, in general, what is the U.S. spending right now on disability, and how is that increased or decreased? Or certainly now we have a new administration. That might affect policy. So do you have any statistics on that?
Do you know that off the top of your head, Rich? Do you know that? I mean, I'll take a crack at it, and please don't nail me to the cross if I get these things wrong. As I recall from doing this homework for this book, Men Without Work, if we put together SSDI and SSI and veterans' disability benefits, we're talking about a couple of $100 billion a year, and that doesn't include workers' comp, and that doesn't include other things. Even in Washington, among friends, it's like a fair amount of money.
But then you want to add Medicare and Medicaid.
Yes, okay, and then you add that to it, and yes, of course, that increases it all the more.
So thank you so much for coming and speaking today. This is all very, very interesting. Thank you. I want to make a comment and then a question. So it's interesting, and I think it needs an appreciation towards the differentiation between the incidence of disability and the increase in the rolls, and how closely tied earned income is to eligibility under SSI and SSDI. As an example, if I was an individual with Down syndrome, I have a disability, but yet I make over SGA, so I'm no longer qualified for SSI or SSDI. Did my disability just disappear? Obviously not. So I think that's interesting. I think it goes back to your point that you made about the environment and the supports and services that are provided defining disability and affecting the roles. So that was one comment. Secondly, I'm interested in your opinions. I mean, obviously we're outlining an issue with the objective to eventually solve it or make recommendations in which to solve these issues. So I'm interested in y'all's perspective in terms of what you might find as incidental factors as opposed to ongoing trends. As an example, everybody always looks to things before we make wide sweeping policy reforms. Are these things just going to take care of themselves? Factors including the baby boomers, increases in youth going to college, vets, Vietnam War veterans, the increase in Social Security age, the recession. To what extent do we believe that these variables and characteristics that you've all pointed out will take care of themselves, and to what extent are these things that we should really expect to continue into the future, and therefore perhaps consider more wide sweeping reforms?
Rich, I think you've looked at this before.
So in one sense, the disability problem is going to be dwarfed by the old age problem and the unbalance between the liabilities that the retirement system has that are going to come into play in a serious way in the next decade or so. But disability doesn't solve itself. It is true that the total number of people going onto the rolls might not rise as much as it has in the past. But what has happened, each time there's been an increase in the rolls, there has been a decline, but the prevalence rate has continued to increase. So one could argue that if we had more sensible rules, those prevalence rates should go back down to what they were in the 70s and 80s. It's interesting that you talked about Jeff Liebman's work that was in the Journal of Economic Perspectives a couple of months ago. It shows you how you can change the numbers a lot. If Jeff started a particular year, if he had started an earlier year, he would have gotten some different numbers with regards to that 1/3, 2/3. But also what he does, and this is just how you think about things, one of the variables that he says is beyond the control of the DI program is the unemployment rate. Well, why is it out of the control of the DI program, since DI doesn't say, there's nothing about not being able to find a job given that you're capable because unemployment rates are high. It's based on your ability to work. So when I'm talking about it becoming more of an unemployment program, I'm saying that when unemployment is affecting your disability rules, that's an unemployment problem. And do we really want the DI program to be the first solution to unemployment? I think that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about policy changes.
I'm going to annoy people and have one more question. You in the red? Yep.
Jennifer Laszlo, Mizrahi from Respectability. There's a couple pieces of data that I'd love for you to reflect on. So the first is that the Kessler Foundation funded Andrew Houghtonville to do some look at people with disabilities, do they want to work or not? A very, very sophisticated study showed that 70% of people with disabilities want to work. So I'd like to challenge the premise that people want to be on benefits, because the vast majority, and our group also did a study on this, the vast majority of people with disabilities want a job and don't want to be on benefits, number one. Number two is that the University of New Hampshire has done an extraordinary job of breaking this down by state. And so while the national numbers have been consistent over a period of time, what you see is an extraordinary difference by states, so that the gap in labor force participation rate between people with and without disabilities is extraordinarily different depending on the policies of the state. So you see that Governor Dugard or Branstad or some of the other governors have a 50% employment rate for their individuals with disabilities, and here in Montgomery County it's 50% employment rate, but Baltimore and other states have 25%. And that is an extraordinary difference when you look at a population of 22 million working age people with disabilities, 11 million of whom are living on government benefits, 70% of whom would rather not be living on government benefits. So the question is, have you seen that data? It's really quite extraordinary.
I haven't dealt with that data at all. I am aware in general of the strikingly high workforce participation rates and employment rates of people who have disabilities. So, I mean, I think that's one thing which we can note to begin with. In my own homework, I noted an analogous thing to what you're describing, which is the tremendous difference in the proportion of prime-age men who are out of the labor force depending upon state. And even in states which are adjacent to each other, you have some of the ones with the highest out-of-workforce next to some of the ones with the lowest out-of-workforce, like Maine and New Hampshire. So there are things which have to be explained in looking at those sorts of variations.
So I'll just say that in 1989, 40% of people who reported that they had work limitations were employed. In 2012, 22% of those folks are employed. What happened? I think that's the real question that we're asking here. And one possibility is that the severity of the conditions that people with work limitations have increased sufficiently so that that's explained the 50% decline. The other explanation is that there are alternatives that people are seeking when they can't get a job. No one quits a good job to go on disability, but when you become unemployed, you're separated from your employer and you need income, you have to make a decision between the work path and the disability path. And sometimes people go down that path, and the problem is there's no exits on that path. That's the problem. And how do you get people back on? And our disability system, the SSDI program, you don't get access to any of these benefits until you've demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that you can't work. And then only after that do you start to get benefits. That seems to be a crazy system. That's the system we have.
Great. Well, we are out of time, so thank you to the panelists for stimulating discussion. We're giving them a round of applause. Thank you very much. I guess I did have.
Because we do have a lot to discuss, especially after that first panel. And I just want to thank our first panelist so much for giving us a lot to think about. My name's Angela Rashidi. I'm research fellow here at AEI in the Poverty Studies team. And when I was thinking about putting this panel, or really this event together, I was really hoping that the first panel would get us all thinking. And it's very clear after listening to the first panel, you can have some very smart, very brilliant people looking at the same data and sort of thinking about it in different ways and coming up with some different conclusions that I think are really important and can contribute to the discussion. So thank you. Thank you for that. And there obviously is some agreement as well, as I think Rich sort of pointed out at the very end. We do know that employment rates and labor force participation rates have not only declined across the board, but even among people with disabilities, we've seen declining employment. And what we also know, which is why this is a particular issue that is of interest to me, is that work really is the primary way to get out of poverty, and the lack of work is the primary driver of poverty. So if we want to think about ways to reduce poverty, we really do have to take on this issue of disabilities and illness that prevents work. And so what I'm hoping, or what I wanted to accomplish with our second panel, is to bring together the people who do this on a daily basis in terms of focusing on populations who have limitations to work and trying to not only support them in work, but realizing their own goals towards work so that they can benefit and have that dignity from work. So before I introduce our second panelist, I just want to mention a couple things. One is, we're talking, and we've talked so far about disabilities, but I think it's particularly important for this panel to think about, the definition of disabilities really covers a very broad spectrum. And you're going to hear that from these panelists in terms of it can refer to, moderate disabilities or limitations, illness when talking about work, to more severe disabilities. And we're going to frame this discussion really sort of around two perspectives. The first is, how do we engage or incentivize or encourage people with disabilities or limitations to work to join the labor market? And really the second perspective is for people who do have limitations to work that want to work, how do we support them from a public policy perspective as well as just a societal and community perspective? So I'm really excited and happy to have these three panelists here. I'm going to do a quick introduction, and they'll talk a little bit more about their work. But with us, we have Allison Wool to my direct right, and she's the executive director of the Association of People Supporting Employment First. APSE promotes the full inclusion of people with disabilities in the workforce, and her organization works with provider agencies across the country to achieve this goal. And she's going to talk a little bit more about the work that they do there. Then we have David D'Arcangelo, all the way to the far right. And David works in Governor Charlie Baker's administration in Massachusetts, and he is the director for the Office of Disability for the state of Massachusetts. And recently, he was part of a national task force that developed a framework for states on workforce development with people, for people with disabilities, and he has a long history working in this field, and I think we'll gain a lot from his insight. And then we also have Grant Collins with us. He is the Senior Vice President for FedCap's Workforce Development Program. And among his many accomplishments in history in this field, he oversees the We Care program in New York City, and he'll talk a little bit about that. That's a program in New York City that seeks to employ people who are seeking cash assistance, actually. It's like TANF or cash welfare, but helping them find work. And so these are individuals seeking cash welfare who have identified a disability or health limitation, and his organization and the program he runs tries to help them find work. So with that, so we are going to forgo any formal presentations, and we're going to jump right in with some questions. And also, as housekeeping, we will have time at the end for audience questions, and just a reminder for those who are watching via the live stream that you can submit questions through our slide.do application, and just look for the code AEI event, and you can enter in a question, and hopefully we can get to some of those at the end. Okay, so David, I think I'm going to start with you. So, everyone can feel free to read David's bio on the website, but you clearly have a very long professional and personal history focusing on workforce development for people with disabilities. So tell us a little bit, based on your experience, do you see employment problems or employment concerns as kind of an issue that we think of more supply side, meaning having to do with the individuals themselves? Or from your perspective, is it more of a demand side issue, meaning employers or the labor market more broadly, or is it both?
Yeah, I think it's both. And just to start, thank you, Angela, and thank you all for being here. This is a very important issue, very near and dear to me. So I think it's both. I think if you look at corporations who want to employ persons with disabilities. They have corporate responsibilities that they're trying to make good on. I'm often hearing from them, hey, we can't find enough persons with disabilities to staff these jobs. If you talk to the mom and pops, a lot of them are unaware that there's even an issue. That, what do you mean there's a problem? I mean, anybody who can do the job, I'll hire it. So I think it depends on the particular type of industry you're looking at. I think it depends upon the particular level of employment you're talking about as well. And you mentioned, so a brief background to give everybody an understanding of my prerogative. I come at this from several different ways. I'm a person with a disability myself. I've been legally blind my whole life. There's been points where I've been completely blind. As a result, I've been on SSI and SSDI. I know what it's like to be in the program and to have to make those choices. And now as Director of Disability for the Commonwealth, it's interesting too, because now I'm looking at all these different prevalence types, and we tend to think of disability as it's this monolithic type of thing, but really, is it? I mean, the challenges that a person with mobility has are oftentimes much different than that of a person who's blind or deaf or mental illness. So I would encourage you all to not think of disability as the universal symbol of the person in the wheelchair when you're going into an escalator, an elevator or something like that. It's really these prevalence types, and solving for each prevalence type, I think, is a challenge, and we try to treat it all the same. And I think, to the earlier panel's point, I think when we do that, we get into certain dilemmas. So how can we start thinking about it by prevalence type? I think that's some of the ways we're going to be able to solve it.
Mm-hmm. And so you're in your position in Massachusetts, what sort of approach are you taking to address kind of both sides of the issue?
Yeah, in Massachusetts, for example, and I very much agree with what was said. Jennifer made a great point too. I think it depends upon your zip code, right? So some zip codes we know are doing very well. There's places, Randy Lewis, who's a VP for Walgreens, has a great story. They have 2 facilities, one in Connecticut, another one in North Carolina, where something like around 35% of their workforce in those particular areas are persons with disabilities, doing very well. You go to other parts of the country, though, in certain zip codes, and it's in the single digits of persons with disabilities. So I think it does depend upon your zip code. And like in Massachusetts, for example, in Massachusetts, there's approximately 770,000 persons with disabilities. Of that, you have about 400,000 that are working age persons with disabilities. Well, of that group, about 2/3 of them are not in the labor force, right? And then in the labor force, there's about 17% that are unemployed. If you add those 2 groups together right there, that's a staggering number. I mean, to me, if that was persons with disabilities are the largest minority group, I would assert if that was any other minority group, this would be front page news, this would be leading the 6 o'clock news. But I think because it's persons with disabilities and these are such long-standing challenges, I think we've gotten a little bit, I don't want to say immune to it, but we've come to accept it. So to me, I think there's a real opportunity now with the change of administrations, with the efforts that are being put forward and the attention on this now. I think it's time for a paradigm shift, really. And there's an opportunity to kind of change the whole dynamic here and recognize that we have such talent, whether it's 12% of the population if you want to look at the ACS, or 20% of the population if you want to look at the SIP or the BRFIS, or all these data points. No matter how you measure it, I just view this human capital as a real untapped source of talent for our country.
Yes, and I think that's a really good point. And this kind of is a question I have for you, Allison, in the sense that in the work that I do, I do a lot of research and we look at a lot of data. And in my world, there's a lot of scholars and policymakers who sort of discount people with disabilities as saying, well, they're just unable to work. They're poor, they're unable to work. We need government programs to help them. And a lot of times, employment for them, or at least when they think about it's not even an option. So I guess I'm curious, given your position and also your background, kind of what is your response to that line of thinking, and what does your organization do to address that kind of thinking?
So the last panel, there was a little debate about whether it was a policy issue or an employment issue, and for the population that our members serve, and let me say most of the people in this population for the providers that we serve are SSI recipients, so people with the most severe disabilities. This is a policy issue. It's important to recognize that this system was created at a time when no one with a disability, when people were in institutions, and when no one with a disability was ever expected to live a long life, much past childhood, much less to be employed. And we still have that system, and we still have that institutional bias in our system. There have been attempts over the years to work around and to build around those biases, but they still exist. And so, as is often the case, policy has not caught up with the market. And so, so to answer your question, we focus on supports for people with disabilities to be able to work and live in their communities just like anyone else. Over time, what's happened is there's an industry that's sprung up that focuses on alternatives to community. And by the way, that's a very well federally funded system, instead of focusing on facilitating people in their communities just like anyone else. I'm also a parent. I have a 7-year-old son with Down syndrome. And I realized shortly after he was born that the policy labyrinth that we have is, for most people with disabilities, is a poverty trap. My dad is a tax and estates lawyer. And shortly after my son was born, he said, okay, so have you written Julian out of your will yet? It's my son. I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, well, you know, he can't have assets over $2,000, and he can't ever really generate substantial income, or he won't be able to get Medicaid supports. And I thought, Medicaid, you know, he's a tiny baby, and that's really what got me into this work, because it never occurred to us that he wouldn't work. He is perfectly capable. And so now we have this system that we have to work around. And what happens is people with disabilities, when they age into the system, if they go on SSI, have to declare, I am unable to work, in order to qualify to get the supports that allow them to work. So many people don't know that Medicaid, and so actually a lot of what was on the earlier panel was really interesting, and it was a good, great, precursor to this panel, because it talked about, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. I'll get back to it. But it talked about, the medicalized system of disability, and that's what we're caught in. So the Medicaid system has, bent to include long-term supports and services for people with disabilities, because there's no other private or public insurance product that delivers the types of services and supports that people get through Medicaid. So you're talking about employment supports, talking about just helping people get dressed, get out of bed, get out into the world, durable medical equipment, vocational supports. I mean, it just goes on. And so really, part of the problem is that we have people stuck in this medical model because we don't have another vehicle. And that's really where we see probably the biggest barrier in our system for people with disabilities. They are afraid to make too much money for fear that they will lose the benefits that enable them to just live their lives like you and I do.
And that's another really good point, Grant, to pull you into the conversation. So, I come from the Department of Social Services in New York City, and so I kind of come from the TANF and cash assistance world. And so Grant does work in New York City as well, but you're working with people who, are not on SSI yet, possibly yet, but are coming for assistance, either TANF related or other cash assistance, but who say that they can't work. And so, tell us a little bit about the approach that you take in your program, and just kind of to this issue about encouraging people that maybe don't think that they can work into the labor market.
Thank you. Sure. Let me first say we start with the assumption that, first of all, there are jobs. Secondly, people want to work. And third, people are better off working for all the reasons that we know. The dignity that goes with it, the income, the role modeling for youth, the lifestyle in many ways is a better lifestyle. So with earnings and without earnings, it's a better pathway for people. New York City has done something that I think is unique. I think it actually provides some hope and some direction for large-scale programs. Everyone who I see in my program believes they should be on federal disability. I do not see anyone who thinks they can work. If they thought they could work, they actually go to another part of the program. I only get people who believe they should be on federal disability. And interestingly enough, over the past 10 years, there's a specific intervention that we do in New York City called the independent medical assessment. So individuals come in with documentations that said, and they say they can't work, and we send them to an independent medical evaluator. After 485,000 of these independent medical evaluations, here's what we know. 6% can work, 44% can work with an accommodation, so straight away, 50% of everyone who thought they should be on federal disability can work. 33% are in a category we call temporarily unemployable. These individuals need what I refer to as condition management for a short period of time, usually 90 days. And then the last 17% are individuals who we believe for the next 12 months aren't likely to work. So we track them towards federal disability, and I'm concerned about that particular group quite a bit. If you do this condition management piece for up to 90 days, usually this is an individual who has co-occurring conditions. Most of the complaints are musculoskeletal, they're metabolic, and they're mental health related. But usually they co-occur. So what we found is if you actually condition manage that set of conditions for up to 90 days, 65% of that group can actually work. So in the end, you have 8% that can work, you have 63% that can work with an accommodation, and you have 29% that look like they might be tracked toward federal disability. So 71% of the people who thought they could not work and needed to be on federal disability actually can work if you build the program that puts them in these various pathways. And that particular intervention is what we call the independent medical assessment.
And can you give us a sense of some of the services then that are provided to get people beyond that initial assessment into the labor market?
Great point. One of the things I should stress is we also fundamentally believe that people should be engaged. I cannot help you if you are disengaged from the system. So we have a very comprehensive program that begins with pre-calls to your appointment to make sure that you can show up. If you need a reasonable accommodation, you need a travel companion, you can't travel during rush hour, you need to be queued to the front of the line once you show up at the location, you need help with reading, you need help with filling out forms. All of these reasonable accommodations we provide for the individuals so that once they do show up, we can get them engaged, as I mentioned before. So we do a very focused case management. In the very first conversation, we do something called positions of interest. We're asking the individual, what are the 3 jobs that they would be interested in having? We start the work conversation very early in the process. Once we get that information, we do a quick mock interview with the individual, and we use their own job choices as the way to engage them in the next phase of the program, which is a diagnostic vocational evaluation. So they'll go through some aptitude tests to determine what they're really good at. We'll take a look at the information from the medical provider, and we will come up with the number of hours a week and the activities that the person will engage in. Those activities include community service or work experience as a way of getting back into the system and being engaged on a daily basis and understanding what work in the world of work looks like, as well as a very robust work readiness component that has interviewing on videotape. We take people out to employers. We bring employers in for hiring events. We have a lot of dynamic activity around this. And then that extends also through 180 days. So we provide retention services. We provide the transportation and childcare. It's a very comprehensive end-to-end program, and it has actually very, very good outcomes.
Great. And David, just sort of following kind of this this line of argument in terms of, that people with disabilities or other work limitations want to work, and how do we, support them, or they eventually are convinced they actually do want to work, and how do we support them? I mentioned earlier that you recently worked on a report that was sponsored by the Council of State Governments and National Council of State Legislatures, I believe, and it was intended to provide a framework for states on workforce development for people with disabilities. And so I know that you are a very active member in that. So can you talk a little bit about sort of what you think states can do, what they should be doing, or just how states, what policy mechanisms do we have to start to address this problem?
Sure, thank you. And I think that was an important report. And there was colleagues in the room here that I want to acknowledge, people like Mike Reardon from ODEP and other people from the SEED Initiative and ODEP and other things. So thank you for the great work you've done. And really, I view it as an assemblage of the 50 states, kind of best practices of what's happening right now in the country. And we really looked at it from like 4 different prerogatives and 4 different perspectives, like what are you going to do to get people ready for work, and then to work, like so transportation, technology, and then what do you do once they're there, and how do we promote, and then how do we really follow up on that? Because I think what we've seen around the country is there are results. We do know programs that work, and they might work for a certain time, like they may work to get them in, but then the people fall off. People with disabilities might fall off, and they had that initial chance and it didn't pan out. So now as a result, their long-term trend is not good. I mean, look at the economy now as opposed to maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I think you were expected to get a job, stay there for 5 years, maybe move to another job for another 5 years, but then you'd get into a job where you'd stay there for 20 years, and throughout your career, maybe you had 3 or 4 different employment outcomes. Now, it is completely different. Now I think you're looking at millennials that are jumping every 6 months or a year or so. So the nature of that dynamic, I think, is very important to recognize here, and we need to be cognizant of that if we're going to try to program for it. I think the other thing, though, too, is one of the things we kept running up against in the SEED Initiative, in the Work Matters report, is how do you legislate desire? Part of one of my other jobs, so I do disability during the day, but I'm also a city councilor at large in a city just outside of Boston, Malden, Massachusetts. And my constituents often come to me and say, hey, I want to work. And at some point, to me, this data that was presented, and Ann, thank you for your data. That was, I think I need to go out and buy an insurance policy, though. But then I checked, so I have a degree, so I'm a little bit better off. But I look at that, and to me, from what I hear from my constituents, and both as director of disability, as counselor at large, and what I've just acknowledged throughout my life is, when you're young, you believe in the American dream. And to me, the closer you are to that dream, the more viable you are, the more healthy you are, the longer you'll live, and all of those good things that are associated with it. But at a point in time, when that dream is not being fulfilled, it becomes a nightmare. And at some point, you drop out. And at some point, you don't take part. And at some point, and so how do we solve for getting people in early, letting them know that there's the American dream, and trying to keep them on that track? And how do you legislate that desire? I don't know. I don't know if anybody here has an answer, but I think those are the terms we need to start thinking of if we're going to try to solve for some of this.
Right. Yeah, it's a very good point. Just thinking about, it comes up in so many different avenues. How do you sort of legislate incentive or really behavioral responses? And so David kind of talked, a little bit about the states. So Allison, since you work with really providers across the country, can you give us just sort of your perspective or what you think the top priorities should be? We have a new administration coming in. Obviously these issues have come up in the past as well, but are there any priorities that you would identify for a new Congress or anything that can be done sort of at a national level that would start to alleviate some of these concerns?
Well, I'm glad that you've asked that question because I've written some of those things down. There's a group in California called the World Institute on Disability that has worked very hard over the last several years on a plan that would decouple SSI from Medicaid so that we do have a Medicaid buy-in program. Not a lot of states have invested heavily and have adopted that program. It does exist, and it's more focused on the DI population, but expanding that program is certainly an option. So income and asset limitations, Social Security Administration had not been raised since the late 80s. So I would challenge anyone to try and live on whatever they were making in the 80s. That has not been raised, and so people, so that would be a question of decoupling poverty from disability. If you can't ever save, but if you need these supports, but you can't ever save and you can't ever accumulate income or build assets, you're stuck. And so we would like to see Social Security the Social Security Administration, whether it's creating a new title, creating a different vehicle, we would like to see some movement on that would really modernize our system so that bring the system to catch up with what we know about people with disabilities. We would like to see our system have its institutional bias reversed, so it's much easier if you're someone with a significant disability to get into an institutional environment, which is significantly more expensive to states and the federal government. You still have to waive out of an institutional placement. So that's through Medicaid. And usually the audience is asleep by now, so I'm really glad that you guys are really interested in these topics. It's exciting. But the institutional bias is a real problem because we know that institutions are much more expensive. We know that people who are institutionalized have poor health outcomes. We know that they're not employed, and as both of you talked about earlier, people who aren't employed and aren't engaged in their communities are really cut off. And so they end up living shorter lives with poor outcomes, and they're substantially more expensive from just from a utilitarian perspective. There was a bill that was introduced in the last Congress, and it's going to be introduced again in this one, called the Transition to Independence Bill. What it does is it incentivizes states to actually not rely so heavily on paying people with disabilities sub-minimum wage, which is still alive and well in this country, and it would really build on the Medicaid buy-in program. But that there are only 6 states where that really took off. So it would require states to continue to build out that program, take advantage of that program, and to employ people with disabilities in their states. Currently, the way that our provider system works, there really is no incentive. There are very few incentives for provider of disability services to find employment for the people that they serve. The Transition to Independence Act really gets at that and does provide incentives for providers and for states to get more people with disabilities. Employed. We know that the system pays in about close to $500 billion a year in disability supports and services, and we really haven't seen employment outcomes move in the last 15 years. So we'd like to see states have more robust data collection systems so that they can understand what inputs are providing better job placements for people with disabilities. We're seeing through the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was passed in 2014, the states are really, it takes a couple of years for the states to really build out their programs. We're starting to see more states shift funds away from pre-vocational services, which is typically no vocation. People that come into pre-vocational services, about 95% of them never come out. So that means they stay in these segregated programs where they're making less than minimum wage, or in day hab programs where they're not making any money, and they stay there for the rest of their lives. We have to break that cycle. Part of the problem I alluded to a little bit earlier is when we're talking about families that are in poverty, once they get into the SSI program, and that they depend on that monthly payment, that monthly SSI payment to make their households run, it's very hard to convince people that work actually makes them better off financially. it does, even if they're having low hours at minimum wage, they're still better off working because now they're consumers, now they're taxpayers, now they have some disposable income. So they are better off. And it's less expensive for the system. For every tax dollar that goes into the system, there is an additional deficit of about 21 cents for people who then stay in a non-paid environment where they're totally dependent on benefits. Even if they're working, again, 4, 8, 12 hours at minimum wage, they do much better in the long run. But they don't quite understand that Medicaid can be scaled based on income and that they won't automatically lose their benefits. But there's a tremendous amount of education to be done.
Can I just build off that for one moment? That is a great point, Allison. And I see this all the time as Director of Disability, is that we're talking as if these are single track, but this doesn't happen in a vacuum. These benefits, whether they be SSI, SSDI, TANF, the whole panoply of housing and cash benefits and everything else, those impact the whole family unit. And it takes a village, and if any person with a disability in that family, they're generally not isolated. These decisions aren't made on just the person's benefit oftentimes. They're oftentimes made on how is this going to impact the whole family. And the person with a disability may have needs that require the family member to actually work less and to pay more care to the person with a disability. So I think it's a great point. It's something we need to be able to solve for. Encouraging things off of that, though, is something like the ABLE Act. That now gives an opportunity to maybe save some money and kind of shield your benefits a little bit. So thank you for letting me jump in there. I want to give Grant
One thing I say, what often happens in the disability system is people, students who come through, they receive a 504 or an IEP coming through the educational system. Once they age out of eligibility, and this is changing with WIOA because people do have VR supports and they're often dually eligible in many states so that they can start that transition planning earlier. But what ends up happening is they fall off that benefits cliff, and suddenly the school says, well, your child is turning 18, so please make sure that they sign up for SSI and get guardianship. And another piece of this is supported decision-making and educating schools that when you have a young person who's under guardianship, that person is no longer has standing in a court of law. It's almost impossible to reverse. And so you have someone who has no agency over his or her decisions. And that's a life of poverty right there. SSI in guardianship, it's pretty much a guarantee that that person will live right on the below the margins, in the margins, certainly below the poverty line for the rest of his or her life. The ABLE Act does go a long way towards that, but if the family isn't able to save and build assets, then the ABLE Act isn't going to help them.
I'm going to there's 2 questions that came in online, which were similar to questions I was going to ask of Grant anyway, and I think you'll have some real insight into this. So I'm going to kind of combine them together. So it's from Laura and Aiden online. One is about, and it's about, again, sort of helping people who have identified a limitation to work or a disability into a job, right. The work that you do. So one is about, it's about government wage subsidies for employment, and I'm curious your thoughts on whether that's an option. And the other is on telecommuting. And is that an opportunity for the future for people with disabilities?
Sure. Let me start with the first one on wage subsidies. We deal with, in the last 4 years, between a population that was formerly incarcerated, a population that was homeless on public assistance, or on public assistance and had significant barriers to work thinking they should be on federal disability, we've put 20,000 people to work. And we engage with employers on a very frequent basis. And generally, employers will tell you that they're less interested in a subsidy, but they're more interested in somebody who's willing to show up and to learn the job. So we don't use subsidies as a way in which to get individuals who have barriers or challenges into work. Quite frankly, our job is to create employer-ready job seekers. And that's the language that we use actually from the very first time we see them. We call them job seekers or participants, And that is the expectation. Of those 20,000 jobs, I would submit to you probably half of them were jobs that individuals got because we were able to teach them the skills that they needed to be their own job developer. And that's a part of what we're trying to do, because we want to do this and instill personal responsibility. It does no good to help someone get a job and then they lose it and they turn around and say, give me another one. That one didn't work out, right? So we have, as a foundation, created these interventions that allow people to really take ownership of their own job and their own pathway, and then we support them along the way. Secondly, there's always an opportunity to telecommute or to use distance learning as a way in which people can engage constructively, whether they're not ambulatory or whether it's a weather issue or whatever have you. In fact, we have a tool that we use called FedCap Academy that has 3,000 modules that an individual can study in about 10 different sectors, so that you can learn what you need to learn in that modality, as well as coming and being present.
David or Allison, have you seen any innovations on the telecommuting side or anything to share on that?
Yeah, I really think that there's opportunity there. I see a tremendous amount of opportunity there, particularly for this new generation where, not to date the panelists, but when we went to school, we didn't have an iPad in every classroom. Now, it is so omnipresent, it's everywhere. So with the rise of technology, I really think that technology can be used as that force multiplier to level the playing field across a lot of different disabilities. And we know for a significant amount of people with developmental disabilities, for example, that they're very inclined to be able to use technology and computers very well. So I do view the future as very bright for certain prevalence types of persons with disabilities to be able to make entree into that space and kind of expand upon existing things. And again, we know certain prevalence types do very well for certain occupations. How can we then kind of channel that and line that up so it's an incentive, really? And to me, it's all about access and opportunity. How can we get them access to the opportunities? And I view this human capital as just a tremendous amount of untapped potential for our country. I really do.
Can I just add to that real quickly? There's two things that I didn't mention that I do want to, in light of the previous panel that showed us the various slides. 43% of the population that I'm referring to is male. And when we looked at the last 5,500 jobs and asked who was getting them, 64% were ages 39 to 60. And I did not see that coming. So not only can individuals who think they should be on federal disability work, half of them can work after a medical assessment. 71% can work after a short-term stabilization of their medical conditions. 25% more than expected get and keep jobs over 180 days. And 64% of those who get jobs are age 39 to 60. So there is definitely hope, and I do believe it has a lot to do with policy, and that these were induced. And so you can create a program like this, for example, and you can think about any number of populations. The one I like to think about are the individuals who try to apply for federal disability and have been denied once, they've been denied twice, they've been denied a third time, have no on-ramp to employment services. So you can imagine how something like this that deals with condition management, that does outreach, and provides these types of services might make sense for someone who has been denied federal disability. And I want to make that point clear, because the concern, and I think all of us know this, is once you have been put into that pathway, you start to behave like that, even if your real life chances of getting federal disability are close to zero.
Right. And I think that really speaks to the point we talked about earlier about not discounting people, right? Because they identify an issue. I have many more questions, but I want to engage the audience. We'll start right over here.
Yeah, I'm Carl Pulzer. I'm a longtime health policy analyst, and I have a project where I'm working on economic inclusion and inequality also. My question is about the Affordable Care Act and the potential for decoupling, partially at least, what the issue about the medicalization of disability benefits. Because what it really did was, for the first time, adults are eligible for Medicaid. And of course, 20 states didn't expand. And then if you're making money, you can go on the exchange. So you, as a person with disabilities, could either be eligible by virtue of the SSI and the disability, or just like any other person. So could we have a system where, if the ACA is repaired, where everybody would get health care benefits like everybody else, and maybe you could have a wraparound of the supports through Medicaid or some other program. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we want to be careful on how much government involvement there is, because to me, the thing that's going to drive all of this is opportunity for persons with disabilities and the American dream, and just good old-fashioned capitalism to an extent. You know, showing people with disabilities, modeling for them that you don't necessarily need the programs. Now, with that said, as the greatest country in the world, we should absolutely have a system, a safety net system that works for people, and if they're not able to participate fully in the private sector, fine, we should be able to provide for them. But I think we've been very generous for them with persons with disabilities generally. So now how can we go to business, and how can we say to business, look, this works for your business model, and this is a population right here that can help improve your bottom line. Once we do that, all of a sudden, because really, look at vocational rehabilitation programs, for example. Well, because the Affordable Care Act is a big government program that's going to come in and supposedly try to take care of everybody. I'm telling you, it would have to be so massive, so large, that you're not going to be able to do it. The better way to, and for a portion of the population, yes, absolutely, it's going to suit them. But for a larger amount of persons with disabilities, we've got to find a way to have the private sector incented so that these people enter the private sector and don't have to do that. Now, whether we can work a deal with the government and say, you know what, we're going to pick up your health care, we're going to pick up your other safety net programs to ensure that you don't have to worry about that, maybe that's where a deal can be had between the public and private sectors to incent persons with disabilities. Because right now it is a disincentive, to Allison's point. There's this threshold. You make $1 over, and all of a sudden you fall off. You lose your health care, you lose your housing, you lose your cash payments and all other things. So there's got to be a way now with technology to have a little bit of a barometer. You know, at first Social Security had that 18-month trial work period. That was the rage back, 20, 30 years ago. That was going to solve everything. Well, it didn't. We still have these rates that have been historically troublesome.
I guess I have a little bit of a different perspective on that, because I think, and maybe this is what you're talking about, David, in terms of a part of the population we have a part of the population that will always rely on government supports, and for that population, the Affordable Care Act has been really the difference between being in an institution and being supported in communities. I'm talking specifically about community first choice, and I'm talking about the waivers, the 1915 waivers that have been part of the Affordable Care Act. So bringing that back is going to be really hard to, if the Affordable Care Act is repealed, it's going to be really hard to replace those, because in many states there are years-long waiting lists for waiver services, Medicaid waiver services, and in some states that took the expansion, they've really been able to reduce those, so that there are more people, out living, working in their communities. And so I think we have to, we do need further employer engagement, but we have to remember that there is a part of the population that will always have some dependence on the system, just in order to function.
Right up front here.
Hi, I'm Melissa Ortiz with Able Americans, and I am so encouraged, especially by this gentleman in the middle, to hear what you're saying about being employer ready, because that's a huge issue, and my friend here at Respectability addresses that, and that's huge. I want to throw out a scenario to you, what you said about adopting the mentality of that I can't work. When I married my husband, I was recovering from a pretty severe battle with endometrial cancer, and I went to New York to live with him, and we went to talk about, we weren't sure if I was going to be able to go back to work yet or not. And when I was able to prove that I could go back to work, I went to talk to them because I wanted to do everything above board, And the agent that I dealt with at Social Security looked at me and she said, "You're crazy." I said, "Excuse me?" And she said, "Why on earth would you want to go to work when we can take care of you and you can just kind of sit around and do whatever you want to all the time?" She said, "I would not be here if I could get a check from the government." I was appalled. And I had to sit there and repeat to myself, "I am an adult. I do not bite other adults." Because I was just that appalled, and I had to jerk up my service dog and quickly leave the office. And how do you address that in the programs that you're working with? Because I think it's a policy issue, but it's also a personnel issue in that you have these people who incentivize and encourage people to be, and I'm going to say the ugly word, deadbeats, when they could be completely participatory in society and completely, in spite of and because of their disability, offering amazing skills and perspectives at the table.
Can I just, let me first respond by saying the program that preceded We Care actually had more government intervention in it. And I think one of the best decisions that was made was to allow the eligibility specialists to do what they are good at, and that's to determine eligibility. Don't argue with whether or not a person believes that they're disabled. Send them to experts, providers, and do the independent medical assessment. And the independent medical assessment tells you things that you can't look and tell. You can't look at somebody and tell if they have diabetes. You can't look at them and just know that. So in some ways, the actual independent medical assessment told more information that the person didn't know that was necessary. They actually were sick, but they didn't really actually know how sick they were. And in other ways, it suggested that their conditions were more manageable. But when you essentially, in this case, contract it out, government plays a really good role at holding people accountable. And so we're audited on a regular basis. We submit a 27-page monthly report, and we have to defend all of our outcomes on it. It's 45% cost reimbursement, 55% performance. We're incentivized to keep people in jobs long term. So I think that was a great way government crafted something that I think is useful for this population, which exists in every community across the country. I'm just fortunate to work in the one that's the largest of its type. But all of our individuals have to be trained in a particular way, and we're held accountable by the government to make sure that we produce these outcomes.
I had a second question, and she left, so I'll just yell. I'm trying to speak really loudly. Also, what are you doing to work with employers who, here's another scenario from my own life. I got hired for a job in a small company to be their communications director, and before I got home, I had a stupid phone. I didn't have a smartphone yet, so I had to wait till I got home to check my email. And by the time I got home, the person who had just hired me said, "Listen, I need to tell you that we can't hire you because of your medical conditions. We don't want somebody in our office. It will be too much of a distraction with your wheelchair and your service dog and the fact that you might have a seizure and we might have to call an ambulance. It will take away from productivity." He puts all of this very stupidly in writing to me and then says, "Good luck in your future endeavors. But if you want to come volunteer for us, we would like that."
Wow. Okay, well, I think that's illegal.
How do you train employers to learn that accommodations are not a big deal?
So we actually bring them in as a part of our work readiness workshop. On the last day, when all of our participants have gone through everything, they've now got their interview outfits on, we actually have them do mock interviews so that they are actually working with people who now they find to be very good employee candidates. We don't do any overt coaching, right? We just simply say, we have what we believe is an employer-ready team here. And we actually bring employers in, not only for employer panels, but we also bring them in to do what we call hiring events, which is the opposite of a job fair. Job fairs are set up for employers. A bunch of people come, they pick 2 people. Hire fairs are different. You come, you have 20 openings. That's the only way you get in the door. You're on site at my location. And I only give you my employer-ready job seekers to engage with. So it incentivizes the rest of others to get ready because we have employers usually twice a month on site. So So our proximity to employers, and I believe now somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,213 employers have hired our participants. So we know that employers know who we are and who our participants are, but we just really have to stress that this is about being employer ready. And we just make sure that the employers come in and see that, and that's gone a long way for us.
Great. I think we have time for one or two more. Right in the middle here? Yep. Just the mic.
Yep.
Yes. Yep. Go ahead.
Grant, you commented about that the employers don't seem to want subsidies.
Correct.
But it seems to me that we provide all sorts of benefits and subsidies for people to get rid of workers in terms of greater productivity. But employers who provide jobs to people are really providing something of enormous value for which they're not getting paid. And what do you think of providing subsidies for less productive, measured by output per employee?
Sure.
Less productive companies should be subsidized.
Less productive companies should be subsidized?
Less productive, who provide more jobs.
Oh, right, yes.
Should be subsidized.
Sure. I am not opposed to a subsidy. I actually think that subsidized employment is a lane that we should be expanding on for a whole lot of reasons, for a whole lot of populations. It's not one that we actually use in my particular program, but I do think subsidized employment is a great way to add another pathway for those that need it, versus what we do, which is more of a community service type model. So I do think there's another lane that's there. But I think that what we should be doing in our programs is that we should be thinking about our programs as being, jobs are almost an entitlement. Think of the job as an entitlement. Not that people can walk in and say, give me one, but that we should be creating interventions that suggest that everyone who wants a job can have one, and that we really focus on making sure that people are employer ready. And I think we get past a lot of this, but I absolutely believe subsidized employment is another lane that we could explore.
David, did you have anything
Yeah,
to
just
add
to
on
build
that?
off that, I think NFIB, for example, has done some nice work around a training wage. Because to me, you got to get them into the workforce early and often. Right now, it's 14 before is the earliest age that a voc rehab agency can start working with a client on what their vocational outcome is going to be. Maybe that needs to be younger. Maybe it needs to be built into the curriculum in our schools. But a training wage, I think, might be able to kind of give people that first opportunity and model for them. We know the data is compelling that when people do have successful work outcomes at early ages and are able to sustain that over a period of time, their chance for employment long-term goes up very much, very significantly. And opposite is true too. If they don't have an experience and they're turning 22 and they've never had a work experience, their potential for long-term employment goes down very significantly. So to me, we got to get them in early and often, and whatever we can do to support that, whether it be a training wage, whether it be shielding benefits, so that they can still use their benefits while they're in a more fragile state economically, the family unit, and then still be able to use those benefits while they're working as well. All those types of things, I think, should be in play to be able to change what we have going on here. Because we've seen the more money you pour into this, usually you would think things get better. They haven't improved. We've poured more and more resources on almost every level, on housing, on transportation, on cash benefits, and it hasn't improved.
So so the last word is we absolutely, our organization absolutely supports expansion of apprenticeships and internships and mentorship opportunities, but would absolutely be opposed to a training wage. We have one today. It's legal under the Fair Labor Standards Act, Section 14C, and what has happened is there's been tremendous abuse of it. People who come into 14C programs are never paid. It's supposed to be pre-vocational. They're never paid real wages, and we think people should be paid what they're worth, which is at least the minimum wage.
Well, everyone, please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you so much. And thank everyone for coming, and the live stream is recorded and will be available online. Thanks again.